The first lesson in this series of 3 looked at ways to classify sentences according to the clauses they contain. In this second lesson, we will look at the various common structures of the sentence itself. The third lesson will analyse some of the exceptions to the basic clause structures in English examined here. Like all explanations about English, this lesson about sentence structure contains many grammatical terms. It's important that the learner has a basic understanding of these terms before starting the lesson. Hence the very brief definitions on this slide. As noted on the previous slide, the traditional definition of clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a predicate. The predicate can consist of a single finite verb phrase, also called a predicator in modern grammar, as in they laughed, or it can contain the verb plus additional sentence constituents such as an object and an adjunct in she played tennis all afternoon. It is common to categorize the sentence structures according to the first letter of their primary constituents. These constituents are the subject, verb, object, complement, and adjunct. The structures we will focus on in this lesson are SV, SVC, SVO, SVA, SVOC, SVOA, and SVOO. These are declarative structures, in other words, sentences that make statements. But we will also take a brief look at interrogatives, asking questions, and imperatives, giving commands. Note that in many grammar resources, you will see the word adverbial instead of adjunct to categorize the types of word or phrase as shown on this slide. So, in essence, adjunct and adverbial refer to the same thing. I've used adjunct in this lesson as it is the term preferred by the authoritative Cambridge grammar of the English language. Okay, let's start with the most basic structure of all declarative sentences in English, the subject-verb-SV order. At its simplest, we have the two-word SV sentence, such as she laughed, in which the subject is the pronoun she, and the entire predicate is the intransitive verb laughed. The other sentences on the slide are further examples of the SV sentence structure. This is the first of 7 structures listed by a comprehensive grammar of the English language, all of which start with the subject followed by the verb, SV. The second constituent order is Subject-Verb-Complement, SVC. Let's first review the definition of complement. Namely, a complement is a word or phrase necessary to complete a sentence in a way that the sentence becomes grammatical and meaningful. For example, the words he is, or that sounds, or I find politics are not grammatical or meaningful without a complement. We'll start with the most common type of complement, namely the subject complement. A subject complement is a word, phrase, or clause that predicates, or says, something about the subject. A verb that links the subject and the complement in this way is called a copula. The most common copula is the verb to be, and the most common subject complements are adjectival or noun phrases. Here are more examples with the verb to be and a subject complement, also called a subject-related predicative complement. Although to be is by far the most common copula verb, there are others that can be used in the SVC sentence structure. Here are examples in each of the subject-complement phrase types. The third type of structure is subject-verb-object, SVO. All the verbs in the SVO structure are transitive verbs, and the objects are direct objects. We will look at indirect objects later. The English SVO constituent order is so fundamental that English is classified as an SVO language. There's more on this at the end of the lesson. The fourth constituent structure is Subject-Verb-Adjunct, SVA. As we saw earlier, adjuncts are constituents that generally tell about when, where, or how something happens. Adjuncts can be simple adverbs or adverbial phrases, as in these examples. In each case here, the adjunct comes at the end of the sentence. But as we shall see later, many adjuncts can also occupy other positions in a sentence. The fifth constituent structure is Subject-Verb-Object-Complement, SVOC. The object is a direct object, and the complement in this structure is the complement of the object, not of the subject. Note that in the start sentences, the complement is an adjectival complement, and in the other sentences, it is a noun phrase complement. The sixth clause structure is subject, verb, indirect object, direct object, SVOO. The verbs in each case are ditransitive, which means that they can be followed by both object types. Most ditransitive verbs involve the transmission of something to someone. The something is the direct object, the thing or message that is transmitted. The someone is the indirect object, the recipient of the object or message. Here are some ditransitive verbs and an example of SVOO. The usual order of the two objects in SVOO is the same whether those objects are nouns or pronouns, namely indirect object first, direct object second. However, the last combination here, where the noun is the indirect object and the pronoun is the direct object, is problematic. We will come back to this later in the lesson. The seventh and last constituent order to be examined is Subject-Verb-Object-Adjunct, SVOA. Remember, an adjunct is a word or a phrase that provides additional information about other constituents in a sentence. For example, to modify a verb in order to state how something is done. The adjunct very often comes at the end of the sentence in English. The SVOA structure is a very common alternative to SVOO. So, for example, instead of she sent her mother a letter, SVOO, we have she sent a letter to her mother, SVOA. And instead of he baked his friends a cake, we have he baked a cake for his friends. The slide has other examples of these alternative structures with the same meaning. The SVOA structure solves the SVOO problem we looked at earlier, namely when the indirect object is a noun and the direct object is a pronoun. Google shows that by far the most preferred solution in such problematic cases is to use the SVOA constituent order. See the teacher example for one reason why the SVOA order is often preferable in such contexts, namely because the adjunct at the end of the sentence complies with the information packaging principle of end wait. The SVOA structure we have just been looking at is one of the 7 structures that are typically listed in grammar materials. However, there are additional structures that have adjuncts in different positions, or indeed have more than one adjunct. Examples are the ASVOAA structure, sometimes I eat breakfast in bed on a Sunday morning, and the SAVOOA structure, He always sends his mother a bunch of flowers when she's not feeling well. Essentially, the possible positions of adjuncts are at the start of the sentence, between the subject and the verb, and at the end of the clause. A few adjuncts, such as suddenly, can appear naturally in all three positions, but not all adjuncts can, particularly not prepositional phrases such as in the basement. And with a very few exceptions, adjuncts cannot come between the finite verb and its following object. One final point before the quiz. If one of the constituents is a finite clause, then it has its own constituent order. Take the SVOA sentence, I ate 2 pizzas because I was very hungry. The subordinate or dependent clause, because I was very hungry, is an adjunct in the sentence as a whole. But as a finite clause, it has its own SVC constituent structure. Quiz page. Pause the video if you want to review the questions and answers before continuing. So far, all the examples we have analysed have been declarative sentences. Let's look very briefly at the structures of 2 other sentence types, namely imperatives and interrogatives. Imperatives are sentences that give orders or advice. In most cases, there's not an explicit subject, but the implied subject is you. Wait means you wait. Imperative sentences exactly follow one of the 7 clause patterns that we've seen above without the subject. Interrogatives, in other words, sentences that ask questions, are more complex in terms of their constituent order, since there are 2 kinds of question and 2 kinds of question word. Yes/no questions have no question word, while WH questions have one of the adverbs or pronouns beginning with the letters WH, as well as the interrogative adverb how. We'll start with yes/no questions, as these are the easiest. They follow the 7 declarative sentence word orders we have looked at already, except in one important respect, namely that the subject and the finite verb invert or change places. So all yes/no questions start with the finite verb and are followed by the subject, VS. Note that the finite verb is the auxiliary verb that is needed to form the question in English, except when the main verb is the verb to be, as in the VSC example here. And note also that some grammarians insert a small letter V to show the position of the non-finite verb in the separated verb phrase. Now we will look at the first type of WH question, namely those starting with one of the interrogative adverbs, when, where, why, and how. These adverbs start the sentence and, as with yes/no questions, the finite auxiliary verb comes next, before the subject. So again we have a VS structure, followed by the same constituent order that we've seen in declarative sentences. Finally, on interrogatives, we will look at WH questions starting with one of the interrogative pronouns, who, which, what, whom, whose. Interrogative pronouns are more difficult than interrogative adverbs, since pronouns, like nouns, can perform various functions in a sentence. So basically, since the interrogative pronoun comes first, the sentence starts with either the subject or the complement or one of the objects. In most of the examples used so far in this lesson, the subject, the complement or the object has been a simple noun phrase, in other words, a noun or a pronoun. And the adjunct has been a simple adverb or a prepositional phrase. The purpose of this approach was to initially put the full focus on the structures themselves, rather than on the composition of the constituents. Before finishing, however, it's useful to see how these structures look when the constituents they contain are more complex or uncommon. Here are example sentences from articles in the Guardian newspaper in which the constituents themselves are much more complex. Here's one more example of the kind of sentences you frequently see in academic text or serious news reporting, in which more than one constituent is a complex phrase or clause. Quiz page. Pause the video if you want to review the questions and answers before continuing. Before concluding this lesson, it may be interesting to know how other languages structure their sentences. Linguists classify English as an SVO language, along with Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, and other less widely spoken languages. The most common constituent order, however, is SOV. This order is used in Japanese, Korean, and Turkish, among many others. German is classified as an SVO language, but in fact it has a greater variation in the positioning of its constituents than English does. In many constructions, verbs occupy different positions than their positions in equivalent English sentences. Furthermore, German has a case system and its nouns and determiners are inflected. Case endings allow subjects and objects to be identified as such, even if they're not in the default subject and object positions. In conclusion, knowing the default constituent orders such as SVC and SVOO is important for constructing grammatical sentences that communicate ideas clearly and effectively. However, advanced learners of English need to know that there are exceptions to these basic structural conventions. Writers and speakers often intentionally place clause constituents in an unusual position for emphasis or impact. You can find out more about these exceptions in the third video of this series on English syntax. Okay, you've now come to the end of this second lesson on English syntax, namely the common structures of finite clauses. Here is a summary of the important information about this grammatical topic. In the description below this video, you will find a link to the lesson index page shown on the left. As you can see, there are 4 ways to access the content, as well as a glossary and links to quizzes and more information on the topic.